Thrown out at 15, she hid in an abandoned water tank. Magnus Stodall, who had buried a wife and 2 children to Nebraska winters, said, "The cold will kill you before Christmas." She had $11, no family, and needed 2 cords of wood she had no axe to cut. On January 12, 1888, the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 3 minutes. But 5 months earlier, Thea Larsdotter had never spent a single night without a roof over her head in her life. The wagon master's name was Josiah Pruitt, and he delivered the verdict at dawn on the 4th of September, 1887. Thea stood beside the fresh grave where her father lay under 2 feet of Nebraska dirt, the wooden cross already tilting in the wind. 23 wagons formed a half circle behind Pruitt. Not one person would meet her eyes. The vote was 19-4, Pruitt said. "You can't travel with us." Thea heard the words, but could not make them mean anything. Her father had been coughing blood for 6 days. The fever took him on a Tuesday. Now it was Thursday, and the wagon train that had been her home for 4 months was leaving her behind. "My father paid for passage to Montana," she said. Her voice came out thin, a child's voice. She was 15 years old. "Your father's dead." Pruitt did not say it cruelly. He said it the way a man states that water runs downhill. "The Hendricksons think it's typhoid. The Crosbys think it's consumption. Either way, nobody wants to share a cook fire with you for 8 more weeks. I'm not sick. You might be. That's enough." Behind Pruitt, a woman named Gerda Olson clutched her 2 young sons against her skirts and pulled them back another step. Thea had braided those boys' hair the week before when their mother was too exhausted to do it herself. Now Gerda looked at her like she was already a corpse. Pruitt reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather pouch. Coins clinked inside. $11, he said. What your father had left, minus what we owed the teamster for the extra weight. He held it out. Thea did not take it. After a moment, he set it on the ground at her feet. "There's a railroad water stop about 4 miles east," Pruitt continued. "The section crew moved on last spring when they extended the line to Chadron. Might be a pump house still standing. From there, you can follow the track south to Valentine. 30 miles, maybe 35. Telegraph office there. You can wire for help." 35 miles. She had no horse, no wagon. Her father's belongings had already been distributed among the families who voted to leave her. She had a wool coat, a canvas bag with 2 dresses, a knife, and $11 in a pouch at her feet. What if I can't make it to Valentine before winter? Pruitt looked at the sky, then back at her. His jaw worked beneath his beard. "Then I reckon you won't make it." The wagons began to roll at 7. Thea watched them until the last canvas cover disappeared over the western ridge, and then she was alone in a landscape so flat she could see the curve of the earth. The wind carried the smell of dry grass and something else, something metallic and cold, the first hint of what was coming. She picked up the $11. She started walking east. The water stop appeared in late afternoon, a cluster of wooden buildings arranged beside a rusted iron tower that rose 40 feet against the pale sky. Thea had seen railroad water towers before, but always from a distance, always while passing through towns that had hotels and general stores and people. This place had nothing. The building slumped. The tower's tank sat at the top of its frame like a barrel on stilts. Staves weathered gray, steel bands streaked with rust. She circled the site twice before approaching. The pump house had collapsed inward, its roof caved in, timbers jutting at broken angles. The section crew's bunkhouse still stood, but the door hung open and she could see daylight through gaps in the walls. The stove was gone, ripped out, probably hauled to the new camp farther up the line. Railroad ties lay scattered in the weeds, hundreds of them, stacked and abandoned when the work moved on. Thea stepped into the bunkhouse. The floor was dirt. The walls admitted wind from 3 directions. She could patch some gaps with canvas, stuff others with grass. But she already knew the truth. This building would not stop a hard frost, let alone a Nebraska winter. She walked back outside and looked up at the water tank. It was enormous. 20 feet across at least, maybe more. The staves were thick. She pressed her palm against one and felt solid wood, dense and heavy, at least 2 inches through. The tank sat on a platform of heavy timbers about 8 feet off the ground. A wooden ladder led up one side. At the top, a hatch cover sat askew, revealing darkness inside. Thea climbed the ladder. The interior smelled of stagnant water and rotting leaves. Enough daylight came through the open hatch to show her the shape of the space. A perfect cylinder, roughly 14 feet from floor to ceiling, with a heavy plank bottom and walls that curved up and inward to meet the roof. The floor held a few inches of black sludge, decomposed vegetation, and standing water that had never fully drained. But the walls were sound. She rapped her knuckles against the wood and heard the solid thunk of timber that had not rotted. She stood in the center of the tank and turned slowly. 300 square feet, maybe more. Larger than the cabin her father had planned to build in Montana. Thick wooden walls, a roof that didn't leak, and nobody in the world knew she was here. For the first time since Pruitt pronounced his verdict, Thea allowed herself to think about winter. Magnus Stodall found her 3 days later. He was a Norwegian rancher who ran cattle on 1,200 acres of sand hills 20 miles south of the water stop. He'd come north to check on 2 steers that had wandered off, and the smoke from Thea's cook fire drew him like a beacon across the empty prairie. Stodall was 53 years old. He had survived 11 Nebraska winters, buried a wife in the second one, and 2 children in the 5th. He had hands like shovels, and a face the wind had carved into deep grooves and hard angles. He sat on his horse and looked down at the girl crouched beside her fire, boiling creek water in a tin cup, and said nothing for a long time. "You alone?" he finally asked. "Yes." "How old?" 15. Stodall spat into the grass. "You're the one Pruitt's train put off. Heard about it in Valentine last week." Thea did not answer. The flames crackled between them. "Winter's 8 weeks out," Stodall said. "Maybe less. Almanac says it'll be a hard one." He shifted in his saddle and looked at the ruined pump house, the collapsed bunkhouse, the silent water tower above it all. "You think you're going to survive out here?" "I'm going to try." "With what?" "That bunkhouse won't hold heat. You got no livestock, no root cellar, no stores. A girl your size needs 2 cords of wood just to cook through the winter, never mind staying warm. You got an axe?" "No." "A saw?" "No." "Any tool heavier than that knife on your belt?" Thea looked down at the knife. Her father had given it to her on her 12th birthday. The blade was 4 inches long. Stodall shook his head slowly. "Listen to me, girl. I buried my son in January of 1882. He was 17, strong as an ox. He got caught in a ground blizzard walking back from the barn, 50 yards, no more, and he couldn't find the house. We found him the next morning, frozen solid, 20 feet from the door." Stodall's voice did not waver. "You understand what I'm telling you? A boy twice your size, raised on this land, froze to death in his own yard. You got no chance out here. None. The cold will kill you before Christmas." Thea felt the words settle into her chest like stones. She wanted to argue, but she didn't know what to say. Everything he said was true. "Come to Valentine with me," Stodall said. "I'll take you to the station agent. He can wire the Children's Aid Society in New York. They'll put you on a train back east, find you a family. It's what they do." A family in New York? Or Kansas or Indiana? Wherever they got placements. Stordall shrugged. It's better than dying. Thea looked up at the water tank. The late afternoon sun hit the staves at an angle, turning the weathered gray wood almost golden. She thought about the space inside, the thick walls, the solid floor, the roof that kept out the rain. What if I didn't live in the bunkhouse? She said. Stordall followed her gaze. His brow furrowed. The water tank? It's solid. The walls are thick. There's a floor. It's a water tank. It's shelter. Stordall stared at her for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not a kind laugh, not a cruel one either, just the laugh of a man who has seen too much to be surprised by anything. Girl, he said, you can't live inside a water barrel. There's no stove, no chimney, no door. You'd suffocate from smoke or freeze from cold. The tank's built to hold water, not people. But if I cut a door, with what? Your 4-inch knife? Stordall gathered his reins. I'll be back this way in a week. Have your things ready. I'll take you to Valentine, and you can get on that train east before the first hard frost. He turned his horse. Don't make me bury another child. I've done enough of that. He rode south without looking back. Thea watched him go. Then she climbed the ladder again. The first problem was the sludge. Thea spent 2 days hauling it out by the bucketful, lowering a tin pail on a rope through the hatch, climbing down to empty it, climbing back up to fill it again. The smell was worse than anything she had ever encountered. Rotting vegetation, dead insects, something that might have been a drowned animal decomposed beyond recognition. By the end of the first day, her arms shook so badly she could barely grip the ladder rungs. By the end of the second day, the floor was clear. The wood beneath the sludge was solid. She scraped it with her knife and found no rot, no soft spots, no weakness. The cypress planks had been built to hold 50,000 gallons of water. They could hold her. The second problem was the door. She had no axe. She had no saw. What she had was a railroad spike, pried from an abandoned tie, and a flat stone she could use as a hammer. She also had time, endless, empty hours with nothing to do but work. It took her 4 days to cut a door. She started by scratching a rectangle into the stave wall, 2 feet wide and 5 feet tall, low enough that she could step through without ducking. Then she began to gouge. The spike's point bit into the wood, and she hammered it with the stone, driving it deeper, then prying sideways to split out chips. Each chip was the size of her thumbnail. The stave wall was 2¼ inches thick. Her hands blistered by the end of the first day. The blisters broke by the end of the second. By the fourth day, her palms were leather. But she had a door. Not a clean door. The edges were ragged, the corners uneven, but an opening in the wall of the tank large enough to climb through. She hung a blanket over it, weighted at the bottom with stones. It wasn't much. It was a start. The third problem was heat. Nels Hendrickson was the practical skeptic. He was 22 years old, the son of the Hendrickson family that had accused her father of typhoid. He had stayed behind when the wagon train moved on, took a job with the railroad at Valentine, saved his wages, and filed a homestead claim on a quarter section of land 6 miles from the water stop. He was building a sod house for the winter. He rode up on the morning of the 15th of September, saw the blanket hanging from the water tank, and shouted until Thea appeared. "So it's true," he said. "You really are trying to live in there." Thea stood on the platform outside her door, looking down at him. She had not spoken to another person in 11 days. "It's shelter," she said. Hendrickson dismounted and walked around the base of the tower, studying it from different angles. He was tall and thin, with pale hair and a face that hadn't yet learned to hide what he was thinking. Right now it showed confusion. "The walls are thick," he said slowly. I'll give you that. But there's no way to heat it. You put a fire in there, you'll fill it with smoke. You put a stove in there, you've got no chimney. Even if you cut a hole for a stovepipe, the draft won't work right. The tank's a sealed barrel. The smoke will pool at the top and kill you. What if I cut a vent at the bottom? Thea asked. A small hole near the floor. Cold air comes in low. Hot air goes out high. The stove creates a draft. Hendrickson frowned. Where'd you learn that? My father talked about it. He said it's how you heat a tent. You need airflow or you suffocate. A tent's different. A tent breathes through the canvas. This is solid wood. So I make it breathe. Cut vents, small ones, just enough to keep air moving. Hendrickson was quiet for a moment. He walked around the tower again, this time moving his lips slightly, like he was calculating something in his head. It might work, he said finally. The cylinder's shape would help. Hot air rises to the peak. Cool air sinks to the edges. The stove in the center keeps everything circulating, like a round room. He looked up at her. Where are you going to get a stove? Thea pointed at the collapsed pump house. There's a firebox in there. Cast iron. Part of the steam engine they use to pump water. It's cracked, but I think I can seal it with clay from the creek bed. And a stovepipe? There's pipe in the wreckage. Enough to reach from the firebox to a hole I'll cut in the roof. Hendrickson shook his head slowly. But he was smiling, not a mocking smile, an impressed one. You've thought about this. I don't have anything else to think about. He stood there a moment longer, looking up at the water tank with its blanket door and its ragged edges and its 15-year-old inhabitant who refused to give up. Then he reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Bread, he said. My mother baked it before she left. It's 3 weeks old, but it'll soften if you soak it. He tossed the bundle up. Thea caught it. Why? She asked. Hendrickson swung back into his saddle. Because you've got more grit than anyone who voted to leave you behind, and because when you freeze to death in that barrel, I don't want it on my conscience that I could have given you bread and didn't. He rode away. Thea climbed back inside the tank and ate the bread dry, too hungry to wait for it to soften. It was the best thing she had tasted in weeks. By the 1st of October, she had a stove. The steam engine's firebox was 4 feet long and 18 inches square, too big, too heavy, too damaged for anyone to bother salvaging when the section crew moved on. A crack ran along one side where the cast iron had stressed and split. Thea sealed it with clay mixed with ash and water, packed it tight, and let it dry for 3 days in the autumn sun. Getting the firebox into the tank nearly killed her. It weighed more than she did. She rigged a rope and pulley system using a block she found in the pump house wreckage, threw the rope over a roof beam, and hauled the firebox up the outside of the tower 1 agonizing inch at a time. The rope burned her hands. Her shoulders screamed. Twice the firebox slipped and she nearly lost it. The 3rd time, the rope snapped. The firebox crashed to the ground. The clay seal shattered. 3 days of work gone. Thea sat in the dirt beside the broken stove and did not cry. She did not have the water to spare for tears. She started again. The second clay seal was thicker, mixed with grass fiber for strength. The second rope was doubled over itself and tested with her full weight before she trusted it with the firebox. The second haul took 6 hours, working in shifts. Pull for 10 minutes, rest for 5, pull again. By the time the firebox sat in the center of her floor, the sun was setting and her arms hung like dead meat at her sides. But she had a stove. The stovepipe was easier. 8 sections of rusted iron pipe, 4 inches in diameter, recovered from the pump house wreckage. She cut a hole in the roof of the tank with her spike and stone, another 2 days of gouging, and fitted the pipe through, sealing the gap with more clay. The pipe rose 3 feet above the roofline, high enough for draft, high enough that the sparks would cool before they landed on the wooden staves. On the 3rd of October, Thea built her first fire inside the water tank. The smoke rose. The draft pulled. The firebox crackled and popped as the cast iron heated. Within an hour, the interior of the tank was warm, genuinely warm, warmer than the bunkhouse had ever been, warmer than any tent she had slept in on the wagon train. The cylinder worked exactly as she had hoped. Heat radiated from the central stove, rose to the peak of the roof, spread outward along the curved ceiling, and descended along the walls in a slow, continuous circulation. No cold corners, no dead spots, just even steady warmth filling every inch of the space. Thea sat with her back against the curved wall and felt the heat soak into her bones. For the first time since her father died, she allowed herself to think she might survive. Wilhelmina Croft arrived 2 days later. She was the wife of the railroad station agent at Valentine, a woman who had come west from Pennsylvania 6 years earlier and had never stopped believing that civilization should have come with her. She wore a black dress buttoned to the throat, a hat with a small silk flower, and an expression of profound disapproval. She had heard about the girl in the water tank. Everyone in Valentine had heard about the girl in the water tank. Opinions were divided. Some people thought it was clever. Wilhelmina Croft was not among them. "You cannot stay here," she announced. She did not climb the ladder. She stood at the base of the tower, looking up at Thea with the moral certainty of a woman who has never doubted herself in her life. "This is not proper. This is not suitable. A young girl, alone, living in a piece of abandoned equipment like some kind of vagrant, it is an offense to decency." Thea did not come down. "I'm not hurting anyone." "You are hurting yourself, and you are an embarrassment to this community. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying that a child was thrown away like refuse, and not one Christian soul stepped forward to help her. That is what they are saying. In Valentine, in Chadron. Probably in Omaha by now, the way news travels. I didn't ask for help." That is precisely the problem. Wilhelmina's voice sharpened. A proper young woman asks for help. A proper young woman accepts the charity of her betters. A proper young woman does not climb into a barrel and pretend she can survive a Nebraska winter alone. Thea looked down at the woman in the black dress. She thought about the vote that had left her here. She thought about the way Gerda Olsen had pulled her sons back, as if Thea were contaminated. She thought about Stordall's dead children, Hendrickson's bread, the blisters on her palms that had finally healed into calluses. "I'm not asking you for anything," Thea said. "I'm not asking anyone for anything. I have shelter. I have heat. I have enough railroad ties to burn for 2 winters, so unless you came here to help me, Mrs. Croft, I think we're finished talking." Wilhelmina's face went red. "There is a train leaving Valentine on the 20th of this month. The Children's Aid Society has arranged passage for 8 children traveling to families in Kansas and Missouri. There is room for 1 more. You will be on that train." "No. This is not a request." "I didn't think it was." Wilhelmina's hands clenched at her sides. "If you are not on that train, I will have the sheriff remove you from this property. This is railroad land. You are trespassing." Thea felt something cold move through her chest, not fear exactly, but something close to it. She had not thought about the law. She had not thought about who owned the ground beneath the tower, or whether anyone had the right to take her shelter away. "And if the sheriff removes me," Thea asked, "then what?" "Then you will go where decent people belong, into a proper home with a proper family, where you can learn to be a proper woman instead of a wild creature living in a barrel." Thea looked at the woman for a long moment. Then she ducked back inside the tank and pulled the blanket closed behind her. She heard Wilhelmina shouting for several more minutes, then hoofbeats receding south toward Valentine. Thea sat beside her stove and watched the flames. The warmth surrounded her, steady and even, the cylinder of thick wood holding the heat like cupped hands around a candle. The 20th was 16 days away. She had work to do. The sheriff never came. Thea did not know why, whether Wilhelmina's threat had been empty, whether the railroad didn't care about a single abandoned water stop, or whether someone in Valentine had spoken in her favor. She did not ask. She did not have time. October bled into November. The temperature dropped. Frost painted the grass silver each morning. The wind shifted from the west to the north and carried the smell of coming snow. Thea worked from dawn until dark, stopping only to eat, sleep, and tend her fire. She hauled railroad ties to the base of the tower, dragged them one by one from the scattered stacks, pulled them over the rough ground, stacked them in a ring around the platform. Each tie weighed 60 pounds. She moved 47 of them in the first week, 96 by the end of the second. Her back ached constantly. She lost weight she could not afford to lose. She cut the ties into stove-length pieces using a handsaw she found buried in the pump house rubble, rusted but still functional. The sawing took hours per tie. Her arms burned, her shoulders screamed, but the woodpile grew, 1/4 cord, then a half, then 3/4, 2 cords. That was the number Stodall had given her. 2 cords for cooking alone, never mind heat. Thea needed more. 3 cords at least, probably 4, and she had less than 2 months to cut it. On the 20th of November, the first snow fell. It was not a hard snow, just a few inches, gone by noon the next day, but it carried a message. Winter was no longer approaching. Winter was here. Thea stood outside her door and looked at the white prairie stretching to the horizon in every direction. No wagons, no horses, no people. Just the empty land and the silent tower and the thin column of smoke rising from her stovepipe. She went back to work. Nels Hendrickson returned on the 28th of November with a gift that changed everything. He rode up at mid-morning, leading a second horse loaded with bundles. Thea climbed down from the tower and stood waiting, uncertain. She had not seen anyone in 3 weeks. "I brought some things," Hendrickson said. He did not look at her as he spoke. He was untying the bundles, spreading them on the ground. "They're not charity. They're trade." "Trade for what?" "Information." He finally met her eyes. "That stove design you're using, the center placement, the floor vents, the pipe height. It's working, isn't it?" Thea nodded slowly. "My sod house is freezing. The stove's against the wall like everyone builds them, and the heat pools in one corner while the other 3 stay cold as a cellar." He gestured at the bundles. "I brought a second-hand potbelly from Valentine, proper cast iron, no cracks, also a saw that isn't rusted, and 20 pounds of flour. You tell me exactly how you designed your heating system. I trade you all of this." Thea looked at the bundles. A real stove, a real saw, flour enough for 2 months of bread. "Why?" she asked. Hendrickson shrugged. "Because the girl nobody believed in figured out something the rest of us didn't. And because my sod house is so cold, my water bucket froze last night." Thea felt something shift in her chest, not warmth exactly, but something close to it. The first acknowledgement that what she had built might be worth something. "The center placement is the key," she said. "Heat rises. If the stove is in the center, the heat rises to the middle of the ceiling and spreads outward in all directions. If it's against a wall, half the heat goes into the dirt behind it." She pointed at her floor vents, 2 small holes near the base of the stave wall, plugged with cork that could be removed for airflow. "Cold air is heavy. It sinks. If you cut vents low on opposite walls, the cold air gets pushed out while the hot air circulates above. The stove creates the pressure difference. Hendrickson listened intently, asking questions, making her repeat certain details. When she was finished, he nodded slowly. "That's worth more than a stove," he said. "That's worth a winter." He left the bundles and rode back toward his claim, already planning how to rebuild his sod house heating. Thea watched him go, then turned to examine her gifts. The potbelly was smaller than the firebox, better for the space, easier to control. The saw was sharp, clean, balanced. The flour was fresh. She hauled the potbelly up the ladder that afternoon. By nightfall, it was installed in place of the cracked firebox. The heat it produced was steadier, cleaner, easier to regulate. Thea sat beside the new stove and calculated. With the saw, she could cut wood 3 times faster. With the flour, she could stretch her food through January. With the potbelly, she could heat the tank using less fuel than before. The math was still brutal, but it was no longer impossible. December brought the deep cold. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero on the 5th of the month and stayed there for a week. The snow that fell did not melt. It layered on the ground, on the tower, on the stacked railroad ties, turning the world white and silent. Thea worked inside now, cutting wood by firelight, emerging only to haul more ties in from the stack. The cold bit at any exposed skin. Her breath froze in her nostrils. The water in her bucket grew a skin of ice within minutes of being brought inside. But the tank held. The thick stave walls absorbed the stove's heat and radiated it back into the space. The cylindrical shape kept the warmth circulating. The floor vents drew fresh air in while the hot exhaust rose through the stovepipe. The interior temperature held steady at 45 degrees, even when the outside dropped to 20 below. It was not comfortable. It was not warm, but it was survivable. Thea slept in all her clothes, wrapped in blankets, curled beside the stove. She ate sparingly, a small portion of bread in the morning, another at night, with hot water between to fill her stomach. She lost more weight. Her face thinned. Her eyes grew larger in her skull. But she did not freeze. She did not starve. She did not die. And on the 4th of January, 1888, Magnus Stodall rode up through the snow. He sat on his horse for a long time, looking at the tower with the smoke rising from its pipe, the ring of stacked ties around its base, the trampled snow showing a pattern of daily activity. Thea waited on the platform, arms wrapped around herself against the cold. "You're alive," Stodall said finally. "Yes." "I didn't expect that." "I know." He dismounted stiffly. The cold made old joints ache, and walked closer to the tower. He studied the stovepipe, the door frame, the floor vents visible through the gaps in the blanket covering. "Show me inside," he said. Thea climbed down and led him up the ladder. Stodall moved slowly, favoring his left knee, but he made it through the door and stood in the center of the tank, turning slowly to take it all in. The potbelly glowed with steady heat. The circular space was tidy, sleeping pallet against one curve of the wall, food stores against another, firewood stacked neatly near the stove. The floor was clean. The air was warm enough that Stodall could feel his face begin to thaw. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "The cylinder holds heat better than a square room," Thea said. "And the thick wood insulates better than plank walls. It's warmer in here than your ranch house, I'd bet." Stodall turned to look at her. His expression had changed. The dismissal was gone, replaced by something harder to read. "You understand what's coming?" he asked. "More winter." "Not just more winter. The almanac's been wrong all year. The old-timers are saying this is going to be the worst January in a decade, maybe 2 decades. He moved toward the door, then stopped. There's talk of a big storm building over Montana. Could hit any time in the next 2 weeks. When it comes, I'll be ready. Stordall looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle, salt pork wrapped in cloth. Don't argue, he said before she could speak. My son would have been 32 this year. He'd have wanted me to give this to someone with enough grit to survive what he couldn't. He pressed the bundle into her hands, climbed down the ladder, and rode south into the gathering dusk. Thea stood on the platform and watched him go. The wind had shifted. It came from the northwest now, carrying a smell she didn't recognize. Something electric, something wrong. The sky was clear. The stars were brilliant, but somewhere beyond the horizon, something was building. She climbed back inside the tank and fed another piece of railroad tie into the potbelly's fire. The flames crackled. The heat rose. The thick stave walls held the warmth inside. 8 days later, the morning of January 12th dawned unseasonably mild. Farmers worked in shirt sleeves. Children walked to school without coats. And then the temperature dropped. The morning of January 12th, 1888, began with a lie. Thea woke to warmth. Not the artificial warmth of her stove, but actual warmth seeping through the stave walls from outside. She pushed aside her blankets and climbed to the hatch in the roof, lifting the cover to look out at a world transformed. The sky was pale blue, cloudless, infinite. The snow on the ground had begun to soften, its surface glittering with melt. The air that touched her face felt like spring, 40 degrees at least, maybe warmer. After 6 weeks of bitter cold, the sudden thaw felt like a miracle. She climbed down and let her fire burn low. No sense wasting fuel on a day like this. She could work outside, haul more ties, maybe even wash her spare dress in snowmelt and let it dry in the sun. By 10 in the morning, she had stripped down to her wool undershirt. Sweat dampened her collar. She dragged railroad ties across softening ground, stacking them closer to the tower, building up her reserve. The work felt almost pleasant, muscles warm, lungs full of clean air, the promise of an easy day ahead. She did not notice the horizon darkening to the northwest. She did not feel the barometric pressure dropping like a stone. She did not hear the roar until it was almost upon her. The sound came first. It was not thunder. It was not wind. It was something between a sustained grinding howl, as if the sky itself were being torn apart. Thea straightened from her work and turned toward the northwest, and what she saw stopped her heart. A wall of black cloud stretched from horizon to horizon, rolling toward her faster than any storm she had ever seen. The leading edge churned and boiled, shot through with flickers of lightning that illuminated nothing because the cloud itself swallowed all light. It moved like something alive. It moved like something hunting. Thea ran. She made it to the ladder as the first gust hit, a fist of wind that nearly knocked her off her feet. The temperature dropped so fast she felt it like a physical blow. The warmth of the morning ripped away and replaced by cold so intense it burned her exposed skin. She grabbed the rungs and climbed hand over hand as the world dissolved into white. The snow came sideways, not falling, driving. Crystals fine as flour, hard as sand, propelled by wind that screamed at 60 miles an hour. Thea could not see the ladder rungs in front of her face. She climbed by feel, by memory, by desperate instinct. The wind tried to peel her off the tower. The cold tried to freeze her fingers to the metal. She found the platform. She found the door. She fell through the blanket and onto the floor of the tank, gasping, shaking, her skin already going numb. The temperature outside had dropped 40 degrees in less than 3 minutes. Inside the tank, the world contracted to a cylinder of wood, and the dim glow of dying embers. Thea crawled to the stove on hands and knees. Her fingers would not work properly. The cold had already stolen their dexterity, but she managed to open the firebox door, managed to feed in kindling, managed to blow on the coals until flame caught and spread. The fire grew. The heat began to radiate. But the cold came faster. She could feel it pressing against the walls, seeping through gaps she had thought were sealed, reaching for her with fingers of frost. The stovepipe rattled in the wind. The blanket over the door billowed inward, admitting gusts of snow that melted and refroze on the floor. The temperature inside the tank, which had held steady at 45 degrees for weeks, began to drop. 40 degrees, 35, 30. Thea fed the fire. She stuffed rags into gaps. She hung a second blanket over the door and weighted it with railroad spikes. The stove roared, consuming fuel at 3 times its normal rate, and still the cold advanced. 25 degrees inside, 20. She understood with sudden clarity that she might die, not from lack of shelter, not from lack of fuel, but from a storm so powerful that no shelter, no fuel, no preparation could withstand it. The blizzard outside was not weather. It was annihilation. And then she heard the pounding. The sound came from below, a rhythmic thumping against the base of the tower, barely audible above the howl of the wind. Thea pressed her ear to the floor and listened. The pounding continued. 3 strikes, then a pause. 3 strikes, then a pause. Someone was down there. She pulled on her coat, wrapped a scarf around her face, and pushed through the blankets into the screaming white void outside. She could see nothing. The world was snow and wind and cold, so absolute it stole the breath from her lungs. She gripped the ladder and descended by feel, each rung a small victory, each gust a threat to send her tumbling into oblivion. At the bottom, her foot struck something soft. She crouched and felt with her hands. Fabric, a body, a face, cold and still, crusted with ice. A child. Thea grabbed the coat and pulled. The body was small, 40 pounds, maybe 50, but in the wind it felt like dragging an anchor. She hauled it to the ladder and stopped, gasping, her strength already failing. She could not carry a child up the ladder. She could barely climb it herself, but she could not leave a child to freeze. She looped her arms under the small shoulders and began to climb, one rung at a time, her back screaming, her hands cramping, the wind trying to tear them both away. 10 feet, 15, 20. Each foot gained felt like a mile. The cold was in her bones now, slowing her thoughts, making her movements clumsy and uncertain. She reached the platform. She dragged the child through the door. She collapsed on the floor beside the stove and did not move for a long time. The child was a boy. He was perhaps 8 years old, with dark hair frozen into stiff spikes and lips that had gone blue. His clothes were soaked through. He must have been caught in the morning thaw before the storm hit, his wool coat absorbing moisture that was now stealing his heat faster than the air alone could. His breathing was shallow, barely visible. Thea stripped off his wet clothes. Her hands shook so badly she could barely work the buttons. But she got the coat off, the shirt, the underthings, until the boy lay naked and trembling on the floor beside the stove. She wrapped him in every blanket she had. She pulled him close to the firebox, close enough that the heat could reach him without burning. Then she fed the fire again. The potbelly consumed fuel. The flames roared. The thick stave walls absorbed the heat and radiated it back. And slowly, so slowly, the temperature inside the tank began to stabilize. 15 degrees, then 20, then 25. The boy's shivering intensified, which Thea knew was good. Shivering meant his body was still fighting. It was the ones who stopped shivering you had to worry about. She held him against her chest and felt his heart beating, fast and thready, but beating. She talked to him, though she did not know if he could hear. She told him about the wagon train, about her father, about the water tank and the stove and the thick wooden walls that were going to keep them both alive. Outside the storm raged, inside the cylinder held. The blizzard lasted 18 hours. Thea did not sleep. She could not sleep. The fire required constant feeding every 20 minutes, another piece of railroad tie, another handful of kindling, another adjustment to the draft. The wind shifted direction twice during the night, first from the northwest, then from the north, then back again, each shift creating new pressure differentials that threatened the stovepipe, the door seal, the carefully calibrated ventilation. The boy woke around midnight. His name was Peter. Peter Lindquist. He was 9 years old and he had been walking home from school when the storm hit. His family's homestead was 2 miles south of the water stop, close enough that he had seen the smoke from Thea's stovepipe and known someone was here. He had walked toward the smoke when the visibility dropped to nothing, and he had made it to the base of the tower before his strength gave out. "I couldn't find the door," he whispered. His voice was hoarse, his eyes unfocused. "I couldn't find anything. I just hit the wood and started hitting it." "You found me," Thea said. "That's what matters." "My sister was with me. Anna, she's 7. Thea's blood went cold. "Where?" "I don't know. We got separated when the wind hit. She was right behind me, and then she wasn't." Peter's face crumpled. "I couldn't find her. I called and called, but I couldn't see anything, and the wind—" Thea looked at the blanket covering her door. Beyond it, the storm continued to howl, a solid wall of wind and snow that would kill anyone who stepped into it. "We can't go out there," she said. "Not until it stops." "But Anna, if she found shelter, she's alive. If she didn't—" Thea could not finish the sentence. She did not need to. Peter buried his face in the blankets and wept. Thea held him and fed the fire and listened to the wind trying to tear her shelter apart. Dawn came without sunrise. The storm continued through the morning, the wind barely diminished, the snow still driving horizontal. The temperature outside had fallen to 40 degrees below zero. Thea could tell by the frost patterns forming on the interior of the stave walls, white crystals spreading like frozen flowers across the wood. But the interior of the tank held at 28 degrees, not warm, not comfortable, but survivable. Peter had fallen asleep, his breathing steady, his color improved. Thea sat beside the stove and calculated. She had burned half a cord of wood in 18 hours, more fuel than she normally used in 2 weeks. At this rate, her reserves would last another 6 days. If the storm continued beyond that, the storm did not continue beyond that. At 2 in the afternoon, the wind began to drop. By 3, the snow had thinned enough that she could see the ladder from the door. By 4, the sky had cleared to a pale, crystalline blue, and the sun emerged to illuminate a landscape buried under 3 feet of fresh snow. Thea stepped outside and looked at the world. The cold was absolute, 42 below zero, the air so dry it crackled when she breathed. But the wind had stopped, the snow had stopped, and rising from the white prairie in every direction, she could see columns of smoke. Survivors. People who had made it through the night. Not everyone. They found Anna Lindquist's body the next morning. She had made it to within 200 yards of the Hendrickson sod house before the cold took her. She was curled in a ball beneath the drift, her face peaceful, her hands still reaching toward the smoke she must have seen through the whiteout. She was 7 years old. She had been walking home from school. Nels Hendrickson was the one who brought the news. He rode up to the water tower at midday, his face gray, his eyes hollow. Peter had recovered enough to walk, and he stood on the platform beside Thea when Hendrickson delivered his report. "The Lindquist family wants to thank you," Hendrickson said. His voice was flat, emptied of everything. "Peter would be dead if not for this." He gestured at the tower, the smoke, the thick stave walls. "Whatever this is." "It's shelter," Thea said quietly. "That's all. It's more than shelter." Hendrickson dismounted and walked closer, studying the tower with new eyes. The Crosbys lost their milk cow, froze standing up in the barn. The Halversons lost a son, 14 years old, caught between the house and the woodpile. Minnie Freeman walked 13 children through the storm tied together with twine, and they're calling her a hero in every newspaper from Omaha to Chicago. He looked up at Thea. "You kept a boy alive in a water barrel, in 40 below, in a blizzard that killed 200 people. Peter had started crying again, silently, tears freezing on his cheeks. Thea put her arm around his shoulders. "The storm killed Anna," she said, "not me." "No, the storm killed Anna because she had nowhere to go." Hendrickson's voice hardened. "If there had been something like this between the school and her home, anything, she might have made it." He mounted his horse and looked down at them both. "The Lindquists want Peter back by nightfall. I'll come with a wagon." He paused. "And Thea? Magnus Stodall is asking to see you. He rode through the storm to check on his cattle, and he's been asking everyone who made it where the girl in the water tank ended up." "What did you tell him?" Hendrickson almost smiled. "I told him you were still alive. He didn't believe me until I described the smoke coming out of your stovepipe. Then he just stood there for a minute, not saying anything." The almost smile faded. "I think you surprised him." He rode south toward the Lindquist homestead. Thea watched him go, then turned to look at Peter. "Let's get you warm," she said. "You've got a long ride ahead." Magnus Stodall arrived the following afternoon. He came alone, riding slow, his horse picking its way through drifts that rose to its belly in places. The snow was brilliant under the winter sun, so bright it hurt to look at, and the cold had not relented, 30 below zero, clear and still and deadly. Stodall dismounted at the base of the tower and stood looking up at it for a long time. Thea waited on the platform, wrapped in blankets, her breath fogging in the frozen air. "Show me," he said finally. She led him inside. The tank was warm, genuinely warm now, the stove banked to a steady burn, the temperature holding at 42 degrees despite the brutal cold outside. Stodall stood in the center of the cylindrical space and turned slowly, taking in the curved walls, the central stove, the floor vents, the stovepipe rising through the roof. "I thought I understood winters," he said quietly. 11 years on this land. I thought I knew what the cold could do." He touched the stave wall, feeling its warmth. "I told you this was impossible." "You told me I'd be dead by Christmas." "I did." Stodall turned to face her. His eyes were wet, from the cold, perhaps, or perhaps from something else. "I was wrong." Thea did not know what to say. She had imagined this moment, the skeptic admitting error, the vindication she had earned. But now that it was here, it felt smaller than she expected. Peter Lindquist was alive because of this room. Anna Lindquist was dead because there was nothing like it between the school and her home. The victory and the loss were tangled together, inseparable. "The Hendrickson boys telling everyone who'll listen about your heating system," Stodall said. "The center placement, the floor vents, the cylindrical shape. Half the homesteaders in Cherry County are talking about it." He paused. "The other half are talking about putting you on an orphan train." "Mrs. Croft," Mrs. Croft. Stordall's jaw tightened. She's been making noise since the storm hit. Says the only reason you survived is because God protects fools and children, and that keeping you out here alone is an affront to Christian decency. What do you think? Stordall looked around the tank one more time. The warmth, the shelter, the thick wooden walls that had held against the worst blizzard in 2 decades. I think, he said slowly, that my son might be alive today if he'd had a place like this to run to. 50 yards from the house, in a ground blizzard, and he couldn't find the door. His voice roughened. You built a door. You built a door out of nothing, with no tools and no help and no reason to believe it would work. And when the storm came, he stopped, gathered himself. When the storm came, your door held. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper. This is a deed, he said, for 10 acres surrounding this water stop. I bought it from the railroad last week before the storm hit. I was going to give it to you as charity because I figured you'd be dead by spring and the land would revert to me anyway. He held the paper out. Now I'm giving it to you because you earned it. Thea took the deed. Her hands were shaking. I don't understand. You own this land now, the tower, everything on it. No one can force you to leave, not Mrs. Croft, not the sheriff, not the Children's Aid Society. Stordall's weathered face softened slightly. You survived the worst night this territory has seen in 20 years. I reckon you've earned the right to keep surviving however you see fit. He climbed down the ladder and mounted his horse. At the last moment, he turned back. One more thing. The Lindquists are hosting a community supper next Saturday to mourn the dead and thank the living. He paused. Peter's been asking for you. He wants to show his parents the girl who pulled him out of the snow. I'll be there. Stordall nodded once, then rode south into the brilliant frozen afternoon. Wilhelmina Croft did not come to the supper, but everyone else did. Thea arrived on foot, walking the 4 miles through snow that had compacted enough to support her weight. The Lindquist homestead was a proper farmhouse, wood frame, 2 stories, glass windows, and when she stepped inside, the warmth hit her like a wall. 30 people filled the main room. Homesteaders, ranchers, railroad workers from Valentine. They had come to mourn Anna Lindquist and the 14-year-old Halverson boy, and the others who had died in the storm, 235 across Dakota Territory and Nebraska, according to the newspapers, though the final count was still being tallied. But they had also come to see her. Peter Lindquist found her within minutes of her arrival, dragging his parents behind him. His mother was a small woman with Peter's dark hair and red-rimmed eyes. His father was broad and silent, a farmer's hands scarred by decades of work. This is her, Peter said. This is the one who saved me. Mrs. Lindquist took Thea's hands in both of hers and held them for a long moment without speaking. Her grip was fierce, almost painful. He told us about the barrel, she finally said. The water tank. He said it was warm inside when the storm was 40 below. Her voice cracked. He said you went out into the blizzard to get him, that you carried him up the ladder. He found me, Thea said. He made it to the tower on his own. You went out into the storm. Mrs. Lindquist's grip tightened. Anna couldn't find the Hendrickson place, 200 yards away, and she couldn't find it. Peter couldn't find your door, and he was standing right under it. Her eyes filled with tears. You went out into that, and you found him. Don't tell me you just did anything. Thea did not know how to respond. The weight of what had happened, the boy she had saved, the girl who had died, the thin margin between them pressed down on her chest until she could barely breathe. Mr. Lindquist stepped forward and pressed something into her hand. a small leather pouch, heavy with coins. From the community, he said. His voice was rough, unused to speaking. For what you did, for what you built. Thea looked at the pouch. She thought about the $11 Pruitt had given her in September, standing beside her father's grave. She thought about the sound of wagon wheels moving away across the empty prairie. I don't need. It's not about need. Mr. Lindquist's hand covered hers, closing her fingers around the pouch. It's about what's right. The community supper lasted until midnight. People approached Thea throughout the evening, asking questions about the water tank, the stove placement, the floor vents. Nels Hendrickson stood beside her for an hour, explaining the principles to anyone who asked, drawing diagrams on scraps of paper, debating the optimal stove size for different shelter dimensions. By the end of the night, 11 homesteaders had committed to experimenting with center-place stoves in their existing structures. 3 more were talking about building dedicated storm shelters, small, cylindrical structures with thick walls, positioned between houses and barns, giving families a refuge point if they were caught outside during a blizzard. The idea spread. Within 2 years, cylindrical storm shelters dotted homesteads across Cherry and Sheridan counties. Most were built from timber, though a few enterprising settlers repurposed abandoned water tanks, just as Thea had. The interior heating configuration, central stove, floor vents, draft management became standard practice for any structure meant to withstand extreme cold. The ranchers called them barrel houses. The newspapers called them Norwegian shelters, crediting the Scandinavian immigrants who built most of them. But the homesteaders who remembered the blizzard of '88 called them something else. They called them Thea rooms. Thea Larsdotter lived on her 10 acres for the next 4 years. She expanded the water tank into a proper homestead, building a timber addition onto the tower's platform that gave her a kitchen, a sleeping loft, and a root cellar dug into the frozen ground below. She worked as a seamstress for the ranch families in the area, traded her heating expertise for food and supplies, and saved every dollar she earned. In 1892, at the age of 20, she married Nels Hendrickson. They built a farmhouse on his quarter section, a proper frame house with glass windows and wooden floors, but they kept a cylindrical shelter beside the barn, stocked with fuel and blankets and a potbelly stove ready to light. Their children grew up knowing it was there, knowing what it was for, knowing the story of the girl who had survived the worst night in Nebraska history inside a water barrel. Thea Larsdotter Hendrickson died on the 14th of March, 1947, at the age of 75. She was buried beside her husband in the Valentine Cemetery, 3 miles from the railroad water stop where her story began. Her headstone carries no mention of the blizzard, the barrel, or the boys she pulled from the snow. It lists only her name, her dates, and a single line her children chose from a letter she wrote to Peter Lindquist on the 10th anniversary of the storm. The cold cannot kill what the cold taught me to build. On the 12th of January, 1888, the temperature dropped 18 degrees in 3 minutes at Yankton and kept falling until it hit 40 below zero. Magnus Stodall, who had buried a son in a ground blizzard and told a 15-year-old girl that the cold would kill her before Christmas, stood in the center of a water tank and admitted he was wrong. The stove glowed. The thick stave walls held the warmth inside. The cylindrical shape that everyone said could not work circulated heat from floor to ceiling, and a boy who should have frozen to death slept peacefully under borrowed blankets. Thea Larsdotter watched the smoke rise from her stovepipe into the frozen Nebraska sky. She had $11 when they left her. She had no tools heavier than a knife. She had never spent a single night without a roof over her head in her life. Now she owned 10 acres and a door that even the worst blizzard in 2 decades could not break down. The smoke rose, steady and thin, marking the spot where the impossible had happened. It would keep rising through February and March and all the winters that followed, a signal visible for miles across the empty prairie. The girl in the water tank was still alive,